December 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. Hans Weber sat in the mess hall staring at the plate before him. 26 years old, former lieutenant in Rommel's Africa Corps, prisoner of war. And for the first time in 3 years, he had more food on his plate than he could finish. 3 strips of bacon, thick as his thumb, still sizzling with grease. 2 fried eggs yolks bright as the Texas sun. Toast slathered with real butter melting into golden pools. Coffee with cream and sugar, not ersatz, real coffee. Around him, 200 German prisoners sat in stunned silence. Some stared at their plates. Others looked at the American guards, searching for the trap, the cruelty that must be hiding behind this impossible generosity. Hans picked up his fork, cut a piece of bacon, raised it to his mouth. The taste exploded on his tongue. Salt, fat, smoke. A flavor he had not experienced since before the war, before the desert, before everything fell apart. And then in front of 200 men, in front of the American soldiers watching from the doorway, Hans Weber set down his fork, buried his face in his hands and wept. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his shoulders and echoed off the mess hall walls. Klaus Hoffmann, sitting beside him, young and frightened, and only 19, reached out to touch his shoulder. "What is wrong?" Herrschleutnant Hans could not answer, could not explain that this bacon, this impossible, beautiful, terrible bacon, had just broken something inside him. Something that had been holding together through 2 years of desert warfare, through capture, through the long voyage across the Atlantic. Because while Hans sat here eating bacon thick enough to feed a family, his wife and daughter back in Hamburg were standing in line for 50 grams of lard. If they were lucky, if they were still alive. But this moment, this breakdown in a Texas mess hall, this was not where the story began. To understand why a German officer wept over breakfast, you have to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the moment Hans Weber first set foot on American soil and realized that everything he had been told, everything he had believed, everything he had fought for was built on lies. This is not just a story about war. This is a story about the moment one man discovered he had been wrong. Wrong about America. Wrong about his enemies, wrong about himself. This is the story of 425,000 German prisoners who came to America between 1943 and 1946. But more than that, this is the story of Hans Weber and how America defeated him not with bullets or bombs, but with something far more powerful: kindness. If you served in World War II, or if your father or grandfather told you stories about German prisoners working on American farms, share your memories in the comments below. We want to hear from the generation that lived this history. Your stories matter. They are part of what makes America great. Now let me tell you how we got here. Hamburg, Germany, 1938. Hans Weber was 21 years old, working in his father's engineering firm near the docks. Blohm and Voss shipyards dominated the skyline building vessels for a navy that was growing larger every month. Germany was rising again. Everyone said so. After the humiliation of Versailles, after the economic collapse, after the years of shame and poverty, Deutschland was becoming strong. Hans believed it. Why wouldn't he? He had been 15 when Hitler came to power. Old enough to remember the desperation of the Weimar years, but young enough to believe in promises of a better future. He married Helene Richter in the spring of 1939. She was 23, a secretary at the shipping office with honey-colored hair, and a laugh that made him forget about politics and parades and the storm clouds gathering over Europe. Their daughter Lotte was born in January 1940. 5 pounds, 6 ounces, tiny fists and enormous lungs. Hans held her in the hospital and thought, "I will give you a better world than the one I grew up in." 6 months later, he was called up. Wehrmacht, Engineer Corps, not frontline infantry, they said. Support roles, building bridges, maintaining equipment, safe work, relatively speaking. He shipped out to North Africa in early 1941. Rommel's Africa Corps, the Desert War. Endless sand and burning sun, and the strange, almost gentlemanly nature of fighting in a place where there were no civilians to hide behind, no cities to destroy. Just 2 armies trying to kill each other across empty dunes. Hans did not think of himself as a Nazi. He had joined the party, yes, because everyone did, because you had to. If you wanted to work, but he did not care about ideology. He cared about Germany, about protecting his family, about building that better world for Lotte. The desert taught him things his engineering degree never covered. How to survive on 4 hours of sleep. how to make a truck engine run on contaminated fuel, how to ignore the screaming of wounded men in the medical tent because there was nothing you could do. No morphine, no proper antiseptic, just bandages and hope. He also learned how men died from infected wounds that should have been simple to treat. Franz Keller, a corporal from Munich, stepped on a nail that went through his boot. 3 days later, the foot turned black. A week later, Franz was dead, 22 years old, killed by a nail in the absence of penicillin. Hans never forgot Franz Keller. Years later in that Texas mess hall, he would think of Franz every time he saw the camp, hospital clean and white, and stocked with medicines that could have saved 100 Franz Kellers. By 1943, the war in North Africa was lost. Everyone knew it, even if no one would say it out loud. Montgomery's Eighth Army pushed from the east. American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel's supply lines were cut. Fuel ran low, food ran lower. And on May 13, 1943 in Tunisia, 250,000 Axis troops surrendered. Hans Weber was among them. He had expected execution, or at least brutality. The propaganda had been very clear about what happened to German soldiers captured by the Allies. Torture, starvation, summary justice. Instead, a British soldier offered him a cigarette and pointed toward a holding area where prisoners sat in the shade drinking water from clean canteens. "Are you injured, mate number? Right then. Sit over there. Someone will bring you food shortly." That was all. No beating. No interrogation. Just sit down and wait. Hans sat, tried to process what was happening, failed. The food came an hour later. Canned beef, crackers, an apple. More food than Hans had eaten in a single meal in 6 months. Around him, German soldiers ate in silence. Some cried. Others stared at the food as if it might vanish. Klaus Hoffmann, the 19-year-old machine gunner from Dresden, ate his apple slowly, reverently, trying to make it last. "This is not what they told us it would be like," Klaus said. No, Hans agreed. It is not. But Tunisia was only the beginning. The real revelation came later on the voyage across the Atlantic. 15 days in the hold of a Liberty ship. 2,500 men packed into cargo spaces never meant for human passengers. The smell was indescribable. Sweat and fear and the sickness of men who had never been to sea before. Hans expected torpedoes, their own U-boats hunting Allied shipping. What bitter irony that would be, to survive North Africa only to drown from German weapons. But the torpedoes never came. The convoy crossed unmolested, protected by a screen of destroyers that the Kriegsmarine could not penetrate. The Allies owned the Atlantic now, owned the Mediterranean, owned the skies above and the seas below. Germany had lost the war for resources long before it lost the war on the battlefield. The men talked during those long, dark days below decks, whispered conversations about what awaited them in America. "Labor camps," someone said. "They will work us to death in coal mines." No another replied, "They will parade us through cities. Let their people throw stones at us, humiliate us." Klaus Hoffmann, the boy from Dresden, had darker fears. "They might just shoot us," he said quietly. "Make it look like an accident." Hans did not share his own theory, which was simpler and somehow worse. He thought they might simply leave them to rot in prison camps forgotten, while the war ground on for years. None of them imagined what actually happened. June 4th, 1943, 10 in the morning. The steel gangway rattled under their boots as they descended onto the docks at Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. Hans was first in line, so he was first to step onto American soil. The first thing he heard was not a drill sergeant barking orders, not the crack of rifle bolts, not the jeers of an angry crowd. It was music. Benny Goodman swinging and bright pouring from a radio speaker mounted near the warehouse. Some American standard Hans did not recognize, but the sound was unmistakable. Jazz. The kind of music Goebbels had banned as degenerate. Hans stood there blinking in the June sunlight, trying to understand what he was seeing. Norfolk Naval Base stretched before him like a small city. 4,300 acres of docks and warehouses and cranes that towered higher than church steeples. Ships lined the piers in rows. Destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers that made the Bismarck look small. And everywhere motion. Trucks rolling in endless convoys. Forklifts carrying crates stacked 3 high. Cargo nets swinging through the air with precision that spoke of practice and efficiency and an industrial capacity that made Hamburg look primitive. What struck Hans most was not the size, though the size was overwhelming. It was the people. Black men and white men working side by side. No segregation on the docks, at least not that Hans could see. They shouted to each other, laughed, coordinated the loading of a supply ship with the ease of long practice. And women. Women in coveralls, hair tied back in red bandanas, driving forklifts and guiding crane operations, and doing jobs that in Germany were reserved for men. One woman, perhaps 30 years old, skillfully maneuvered a forklift loaded with grain sacks stacked higher than a man. A guard approached. American, perhaps 22 years old, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He looked tired. Not angry, just tired. "Welcome to America, buddy." He held out a canteen. You thirsty Hans took the canteen. Drank. The water was cold, so cold it hurt his teeth. When had he last had cold water? He could not remember. "Thank you," Hans said in careful English. The guard nodded, took back the canteen, and gestured toward waiting trucks. "Load up, we got a train to catch." That was all. No violence, no mockery, just logistics. Behind Hans, Klaus whispered in German, "This is not possible, this cannot be real." But it was real, and it was only the beginning. The trucks rolled inland through the Virginia countryside. Through the canvas flaps at the back, Hans watched America roll past. Houses. Neat suburban houses with mowed lawns and children playing in yards. A boy on a bicycle, perhaps 10 years old, waving at the military convoy as it passed. His mother stood on the porch, and after a moment of hesitation, she waved too. Klaus stared. "They are not afraid of us. Why would they be?" Hans replied, "Look around. We are the ones who should be afraid." Because the houses kept coming. Block after block, mile after mile, all intact. No bomb damage, no burned-out ruins, no desperate people digging through rubble. Germany, Hans knew with sudden cold certainty, was already losing, had already lost. Because you cannot fight a nation that can build cities like this, maintain them, fill them with people who have bicycles and mowed lawns and the leisure to wave at passing trucks. At a railroad crossing, the convoy stopped to let a freight train pass. Hans counted the cars. Lost track after 80. Each one loaded with tanks or jeeps or artillery pieces still wrapped in factory grease. Someone behind Hans muttered, "They build faster than we can destroy." No one disagreed. The train that carried them from Virginia to Texas was not a cattle car. It was a passenger coach, old perhaps, but with cushioned seats and windows that opened. The prisoners sat in pairs guards stationed at each end of the car, and for 3 days they watched the American heartland slide past. From Richmond to Baltimore, through the industrial corridor where the real war was being won, past the Glen L. Martin aircraft plant where B-26 Marauders sat on the tarmac in rows of 20, 30, 40. A week's production, one prisoner estimated. Maybe less. In 1 week, America produced more bombers than Germany produced in a month. Hans had read the intelligence reports from captured documents. He had not believed them. Now seeing the evidence with his own eyes, he had no choice. Past automobile dealerships packed with new Fords and Chevrolets, past grain elevators towering over small towns, fat with wheat and corn, past diners where families ate hamburgers and French fries and threw away more food in one meal than a German family saw in a week. At a station stop in Roanoke, Virginia, Hans watched through the window as a porter ate lunch. The man bit into a sandwich, ham and cheese so thick with meat it barely fit in his mouth. He chewed twice, then wrapped up the rest and tossed it into a trash bin. Still half full. Next, an apple. The porter ate perhaps half, then threw the rest away. Hans pressed his hand against the window, fingers splayed, as if he could reach through the glass and retrieve that apple. Back home, his mother would have peeled that apple, eaten the flesh, then boiled the peel to make tea. Nothing would be wasted. Here it went into the trash without a second thought. That single gesture, that casual waste, stayed with Hans longer than anything else he saw on the journey. Not the factories or the military might. Just a man throwing away an apple. Klaus noticed Hans's expression. "What is wrong?" Hans could not answer for a moment. When he did, his voice was flat. "He just threw away a day's food for my family." The numbers told a story that propaganda could not rewrite. By 1943, the United States produced 600 million tons of coal annually. Germany managed half that. American oil production reached 1.8 billion barrels per year. Germany, starved of petroleum, scraped by on 33 million. The railroads alone told the tale. 2.5 million passengers daily on American rails, plus unprecedented freight tonnage, all while simultaneously building a war machine that spanned two oceans. Hans did not need economists to explain these statistics. He could see them through the train window. Mile after mile of abundance. Wealth so vast, it seemed obscene. That night, as the train rolled through Kentucky, Hans sat alone in the darkened car while other prisoners slept. He took out the letter Helene had written in March before his capture. The paper was worn soft from repeated readings. My dearest Hans, Lada asks why Papa does not come home. I do not know what to tell her. Hamburg was bombed again last night. Mother's house lost half the roof. We are eating boiled potatoes every day. Lotte has forgotten what meat tastes like. I have too. Please stay alive. That is all I pray for. Helene. Hans had read this letter 47 times during the Atlantic crossing. Each reading hurt a little more. Now watching the lights of American towns flicker past each house blazing with electricity that was never rationed, never cut, Hans read it again. Klaus woke and saw him. Are you all right, Herr Leutnant? Hans folded the letter carefully, put it back in his wallet. No, Klaus, I am not all right. And I do not think I will be again. Because we never had a chance, did we? We were fighting a nation that could wage war with one hand while living better than we ever did with both. The train reached Texas on the third day. The landscape changed. Flatter now, drier. Endless sky that reminded Hans of the desert, but with one crucial difference. Here there was water, irrigation ditches, crops growing in neat rows, cattle grazing on rangeland that stretched to the horizon. Texas was bigger than Germany, had more arable land, more cattle, more of everything, and it was just one state out of 48. The math was simple and devastating. Germany could never have won this war. The miracle was not that they were losing. The miracle was that they had lasted this long. Camp Hearn appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon. White painted barracks in straight lines, guard towers at the corners, barbed wire fencing that gleamed in the Texas sun. Still a prison then. Hans felt a strange relief. At least some things made sense. The truck stopped. Guards opened the gates. 200 prisoners filed through, were counted, assigned barracks numbers, told the basic rules in a mixture of English and broken German. Hans was assigned to barrack 7 bunk 23. He walked in expecting straw pallets on the floor. Instead, he found 40 beds with actuals mattresses, pillows, clean blankets, and overhead ceiling fans turning slowly in the heat. Klaus touched the light switch. The bulb flickered on, off, on again. We have electricity, Klaus said, his voice hollow with disbelief. They are giving us electricity. Hans sat on his bunk testing the mattress. It was thin military issue, but it was real. Not straw, not a blanket on concrete, an actual mattress. Through the window he could see other barracks, a hospital building white and clean with glass windows that reflected the afternoon sun. A mess hall, a recreation area with what looked like volleyball poles. This was not what he had expected. Not at all. That night, lying on his bunk while Klaus snored softly in the bed below, Hans stared at the ceiling fan, turning overhead, and tried to make sense of it all. The propaganda had been very specific. Americans were weak, soft, divided by racial tensions and economic inequality. They could produce goods, yes, but they lacked the will to fight. They would collapse under pressure. But everything Hans had seen contradicted that narrative. The docks at Norfolk had shown no signs of strain. The factories ran at full capacity. The farms were bursting with crops. And the people, the ordinary Americans he had glimpsed from train windows, did not look like a nation on the edge of collapse. They looked prosperous, content, untouched by the war that was destroying Europe. We lost Hans' thought. Not yesterday, not at El Alamein or Stalingrad. We lost before we started. We just did not know it yet. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, Hans dreamed of his daughter. Lotte, at 4 years old, blonde hair and pigtails, laughing as he pushed her on a swing in the park. That memory was from 1938, before the war, before everything changed. In the dream, Lotte asked him, "Papa, when are you coming home?" And Hans, even in the dream, did not know how to answer. Morning came too early. A whistle blew at 6 sharp and insistent. Hans woke disoriented, forgetting for a moment where he was. Not the desert, not the ship. Texas, Camp Hearn, prisoner. Klaus was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at his hands. The boy looked even younger in the morning light. 19 years old, but his eyes belonged to someone much older. "Are you ready for whatever comes next?" Klaus asked. Hans had no answer. He pulled on his boots, the same boots that had walked across half of North Africa, and followed the other prisoners outside. The morning air was already warm, carrying the smell of grass and dust. Nothing like the burning sand of Libya. Nothing like the salt spray of the Atlantic. This was a different kind of heat, softer somehow, almost gentle. The prisoners formed up in rough lines outside the barracks. An American officer stood on a small platform flanked by 2 guards. He was perhaps 40, with graying hair and the weathered face of a career soldier. When he spoke, his voice carried across the compound without shouting. "Gentlemen, you are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly and humanely. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. In return, you will follow the rules of this camp. There will be no escape attempts, no sabotage, no violence. Anyone who violates these rules will face consequences. Is that understood?" A German-speaking guard translated, though most prisoners understood enough English to follow. "Understood," came the murmured response. "Good. Now you will proceed to the mess hall for breakfast. After that, medical examinations. Welcome to Camp Hearn." The mess hall was a long building with high windows and rows of tables. The smell hit Hans before he entered. Bacon, coffee, toast. Smells he had not encountered in years. The prisoners filed in, found seats. Hans sat with Klaus and 3 other men from their transport. Nobody spoke. They waited tense for whatever came next. American cooks, assisted by German prisoners from an earlier transport, moved along the tables with serving trays. What they placed in front of Hans made him forget how to breathe. 3 strips of bacon, thick and glistening. 2 fried eggs, perfectly cooked. 2 slices of toast with butter melting into golden pools. A cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they had been drinking in North Africa. And beside the cup, small containers of cream and sugar. Hans stared. Around him, 200 men stared at their plates with identical expressions of disbelief. "Is this a trick?" someone whispered in German. "Are they testing us?" But at the far end of the hall, American guards sat at their own table eating the same food. Laughing, passing hot sauce, pouring more coffee. This was real. This was actually happening. Klaus picked up his fork with trembling hands, cut a small piece of egg, tasted it. His eyes closed. Oh God. Oh my God. Hans could not move, could not think, could not reconcile what was on his plate with what he knew about the world. 3 days ago, he had received that letter from Helene. Lotta has forgotten what meat tastes like. And here now, Hans had more meat on his plate than his daughter had seen in 6 months. He picked up his fork, cut a piece of bacon. The taste exploded in his mouth. Salt and fat and smoke, rich beyond belief. A flavor so intense it was almost painful. Hans chewed, swallowed, cut another piece. And then something inside him broke, not cracked, not bent. Broke completely. He set down his fork, put his head in his hands, and began to weep. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere in his chest, somewhere he thought had gone numb in the desert. His shoulders shook. His breath came in ragged gasps. He could not stop. Klaus touched his arm. "Herr Leutnant, Hans, what is wrong?" Hans could not answer, could not explain that every bite of this bacon was a betrayal of his family, that his daughter was starving while he sat in a Texas mess hall, eating like a king, that everything he had believed about duty and honor and sacrifice had just collapsed under the weight of 3 strips of bacon. Other prisoners were staring now. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others looked down at their own plates with new understanding. A few began to cry as well. One of the American guards, a sergeant perhaps 30 years old, walked over. He said something in English that Hans did not catch. Then more slowly and heavily accented German. "It is okay. Eat. You are safe now, safe." The word felt like a blade. Hans was safe. His wife and daughter were not. He forced himself to look up, to wipe his eyes, to pick up his fork again. "I am sorry," Hans said in English. "I am sorry." The sergeant shook his head. "Nothing to be sorry for, buddy. War is hell. Eat your breakfast." Hans ate. Every bite tasted like guilt. After breakfast came the medical examinations. The prisoners lined up outside a building that looked cleaner and better equipped than any field hospital Hans had seen in North Africa. One by one, they were called inside. When Hans's turn came, he entered a bright room that smelled of antiseptic. A doctor sat at a desk reviewing paperwork. He looked up and smiled. "Good morning. I am Dr. Robert Hayes. Please have a seat." The doctor's German was accented but fluent. Hans sat in the chair, indicated still trying to process everything that was happening. Dr. Hayes conducted a thorough examination, listened to Hans's lungs, checked his blood pressure, examined the scar on his shoulder where shrapnel had torn through muscle 2 years ago. "This healed well," the doctor said. "You were lucky. My medic was skilled. Even so, another few centimeters and you would have lost the arm." He made notes on his chart. "Any other injuries?" "Infections." Hans shook his head. "Good. I'm going to give you a shot of penicillin, standard procedure for new arrivals. Prevents infection." Hans froze. Penicillin, the miracle drug, the medicine that could have saved Franz Keller and 100 other men who died from infected wounds in the desert. "We do not have that in Germany," Hans said quietly. "My comrades died from wounds that this could have cured." Dr. Hayes paused, syringe in hand. His expression softened. "I am sorry to hear that. War is a terrible thing. We waste so much that could save lives." He administered the injection quickly, professionally. "There, all done. You are in good health, Herr Weber. Better than many who come through here. Thank you, doctor." Hans stood to leave, but Dr. Hayes stopped him. "One more thing. My father came from Dusseldorf in 1903, fled because he did not want to fight in someone else's war. He taught me German at home. Always said that ordinary people on both sides want the same things: peace, family, a chance to build something good." Hans nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I think he was right," the doctor continued. "The politicians and generals, they make their decisions. But men like you and me, we just try to survive them. Go get some rest, Herr Weber. You have been through enough." That conversation stayed with Hans for the rest of the day. Dr. Hayes, with his German immigrant father, in his perfect medical facility, and his casual access to medicines that could have saved hundreds of German lives. Another small piece of evidence that the war had been lost before it began. That afternoon, the prisoners were given time to write letters home. Red Cross volunteers provided paper and pencils. The letters would be censored, of course, but they would be sent. Hans sat on his bunk with a blank page before him. What could he possibly write? How could he explain any of this to Helene without breaking her heart? He tried 7 times. 7 letters crumpled and thrown away. The 8th letter was a lie. "My dearest Helene and Lotta, I am safe in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, America. The conditions are adequate. We have shelter and sufficient food. I am not injured and am being treated fairly. I think of you both every moment. I pray that you are safe and that this war ends soon. Please write to me when you can. I need to know you are alive. All my love, Hans. Adequate. Sufficient." Lies wrapped in careful words because he could not tell her the truth. Could not admit that he was gaining weight while she and Lotta grew thinner. Could not describe the bacon or the coffee or the hospital with its miracle medicines. Klaus, writing his own letter on the bunk below, looked up. "What did you tell them? That I am alive and well? That the camp is bearable? What else can I say?" Klaus nodded. "The truth would be cruel." Yes, the truth would be very cruel. The days developed a rhythm. Morning roll call. Breakfast that remained impossibly generous. 3,400 calories per day, Hans learned. More than double what German civilians received on ration cards. Work details were organized. Volunteers could sign up for labor outside the camp. Paid work. 80 cents per day in camp scrip that could be spent at the canteen on cigarettes, soap writing paper, harmonicas, chess sets. Hans volunteered immediately. Not for the money, for the distraction, for the exhaustion that might let him sleep without dreaming of Lotte, asking why Papa had abandoned her. The first work assignment came a week later. Agricultural labor. A local farmer needed help with the cotton harvest. 6 prisoners climbed into the back of a truck, driven by a sergeant who introduced himself as Tom Riley. From Oklahoma originally, been in Texas 5 years now, talked the whole drive about nothing in particular. Weather, baseball, how hot the summer got. Hans appreciated the normality of age. For 20 minutes, they were just men in a truck, not enemies, not guards and prisoners. Just men. The farm belonged to Earl Thompson. Hans saw that name painted on a mailbox as they turned down a long dirt road. The house was modest, white painted wood, a porch with rocking chairs, a barn that had seen better days but was still standing. Earl Thompson stood in the yard waiting. He was perhaps 50, weathered by sun, in work-wearing jeans and a plaid shirt and a cowboy hat that had faded from black to gray. He watched the prisoners climb out of the truck with an expression Hans could not read. For 10 full minutes, Earl Thompson said nothing, just looked at them, measuring, judging, deciding something. Finally, he spoke. "Y'all know how to pick cotton," the guard translated. The prisoners shook their heads. Earl nodded as if he had expected this. "Well, you are about to learn. Follow me." They followed him into the cotton field, row after row of plants, heavy with white bolls. The field stretched to the horizon, endless, under the Texas sky. Earl showed them how to pick, how to pull the cotton without damaging the plant, how to fill the sacks. It was harder than it looked. The sun beat down mercilessly. Within an hour, Hans's hands were raw and his back ached, but he welcomed the pain, welcomed the exhaustion. This felt like penance. At noon, Earl called a break. The prisoners gathered in the shade of a trailer, drinking water from a pump. They expected to eat whatever rations they had brought. Instead, Earl walked over carrying something large and green, a watermelon. He set it on the ground, pulled out a knife, and cut it into thick wedges. He handed one to each prisoner without a word. Hans took the watermelon slice, looked at Earl Thompson's weathered face, saw no hostility there. No anger, just a farmer sharing his crop with his workers. "Eat," Earl said in English. "It is hot." Hans bit into the watermelon. Cold, sweet juice ran down his chin. It was the best thing he had tasted since the bacon that first morning. Maybe better because there was no guilt attached to it. This was a gift freely given, earned by morning labor. "Thank you," Hans said in English. "Thank you very much," Earl nodded. "You work hard. You get treated fair. That is how we do things here." They worked until 4, then loaded back into the truck. Hans's hands were blistered and his shirt was soaked with sweat, but he felt more at peace than he had in weeks. On the drive back, Sergeant Riley caught Hans's eye in the rearview mirror. "Thompson's a good man. Got 2 boys fighting overseas right now. James is with the armies somewhere in Europe. Robert's in the Pacific. Earl worries about them every day, but he does not take it out on you fellows. Treats you fair despite everything. Figure that says something about his character." Hans felt the words sink in. Earl Thompson's sons were fighting Germans, fighting men like Hans, and yet Earl had given them watermelon, had treated them fairly, had shown them basic human decency. How was that possible? How could a man do that? That night, lying in his bunk, Hans wrote in a small notebook he had purchased from the canteen. Not a letter, just thoughts he could not share with anyone. "Earl Thompson gave me watermelon today. His sons are fighting Germans, fighting men like me, and he gave me watermelon. I do not understand this country. I do not understand these people. They should hate us. They have every right to hate us. Instead, they give us bacon and watermelon and penicillin. They treat us better than our own government treated us in the desert. How do I live with this knowledge? How do I go home and look Helene in the eye and tell her that the enemy fed me while she starved? 3 months passed. September became October, became November. The work continued. The cotton harvest finished. Hans and the other volunteers moved to different farms, picked pecans, mended fences, cleared irrigation ditches. The farmers paid. The food kept coming. 3 meals a day, every day, more than Hans could eat. And then came December. Camp Hearn prepared for Christmas. Decorations appeared, a small pine tree in the recreation hall, red and green streamers. The German prisoners formed a choir, practiced carols in German. The Americans seemed amused by this, encouraged it even, provided sheet music and allowed evening rehearsals. Then came the announcement. The Christmas menu: roast turkey with chestnut dressing, mashed potatoes with gravy, green peas, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and cigars for anyone who wanted them. Klaus read the menu posted on the bulletin board and laughed. The sound had an edge of hysteria. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. Hans said nothing. He had stopped trying to make sense of it. Christmas Eve arrived. The mess hall was decorated with more care than Hans had seen in a military facility. The cooks had clearly put effort into the meal. When the prisoners filed in, the smell was overwhelming. Turkey roasting, pie baking, coffee percolating. Hans sat down, looked at the plate before him. More food than his family in Hamburg would see in a month. He thought of Helene and Lotte in their basement room sharing thin potato soup. Thought of his mother alone in the ruins of her house. Thought of all of Germany starving and freezing and dying while he sat in Texas eating roast turkey. Around him, men ate slowly, savoring every bite. Some cried quietly. Others simply stared at their plates as if unable to believe what they were seeing. Klaus leaned over. This was my family's Christmas meal 5 years ago, before the war, before everything went to hell. And now I am eating it as a prisoner. How is this possible? Because we are not the ones suffering, Hans said quietly. Our families are. We sit here in comfort while they die. Klaus put down his fork. Do you think they would want us to refuse to starve ourselves in solidarity? Hans had no answer. He ate his turkey. Every bite tasted like ashes. That evening mail call brought letters from home. Hans received one from Helene dated October. It had taken 2 months to arrive. He opened it with trembling hands. My dearest Hans, Hamburg is gone. In July, they bombed for 8 nights straight. They called Operation Gomorrah. 40,000 dead. Mother's house is destroyed. She lives with us now. 4 people in one room. Lotte weighs 28 pounds. The doctor says she is malnourished. I am feeding her everything I can find, but it is not enough. I do not write this to hurt you. I write because I want you to know the truth. We are still alive. As long as we live, we wait for you. I love you more than my own life, Helene. Postscript. Lotte drew a picture for you, but we did not have an envelope large enough to send it. She drew you riding a horse in the desert. She thinks you are having adventures. Hans read the letter 3 times. 28 pounds. Lotte was 7 years old. A healthy 7-year-old should weigh 35 to 40 pounds. His daughter was starving to death while he ate roast turkey. He stood up, walked out of the mess hall into the cold December night, across the compound to the fence line. Sergeant Riley on duty in the guard tower called down. Weber, you okay? Hans did not answer. He walked to the barbed wire fence and knelt in the dirt, put his head in his hands, and screamed. Not words, just a raw sound of anguish and fury and helplessness. The cry of a man who has just realized he cannot save the people he loves. That all his sacrifice, all his fighting, all his suffering had been for nothing. Worse than nothing. It had been for the wrong side. Klaus ran out of the mess hall, found Hans kneeling in the dirt. What happened? What is wrong? Hans could not speak, could only hand over the letter. Klaus read it. His face went pale. Oh God. Oh Hans, I am so sorry. Sorry does not feed her, Hans said. Sorry does not bring back the 40,000 dead in Hamburg. Sorry does not rebuild mother's house or cure Lotte's malnutrition. Sorry is the most useless word in any language. He stood up, looked at Klaus with eyes that felt dead inside. Do you know what the worst part is? The worst part is that I cannot even starve with them. I tried. 2 weeks ago, I tried to refuse meals, to eat only half portions. Do you know what happened? The camp doctor called me in, asked if I was sick, said they would force feed me if necessary to maintain my health, because that is what the Geneva Convention requires. So I cannot even suffer with my family. I have to sit here growing fat while they die. Klaus had no answer. There was no answer. They stood together in the cold Texas night, 2 German soldiers 10,000 kilometers from home, eating better than they ever had in their lives while their families starved. The contradiction was too large to hold in one mind without something breaking. Something in Hans had just broken. He could feel it. A fundamental piece of who he was, who he thought he was cracking and falling away. He had believed in Germany, in duty, in the righteousness of protecting his homeland. He had told himself that his sacrifice meant something, that fighting and killing and nearly dying in the desert was for Helene and Lotte, to give them a better world. But that better world did not exist, had never existed. And the people he had been fighting, the Americans who were supposed to be soft and weak and decadent, they were the ones showing mercy, showing humanity, treating prisoners better than Germany treated its own people. What did that make him? What did that make everything he had done? The questions had no comfortable answers. So Hans stopped asking them, stopped thinking about them. He went back to his bunk, lay down, stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. Tomorrow he would get up, eat breakfast, go to work detail if assigned, come back, eat dinner, sleep, repeat, day after day, week after week, month after month, an endless routine of comfort and guilt, because there was nothing else he could do. Nowhere else he could go. He was a prisoner. And for the first time, Hans understood that the bars around him were not just made of barbed wire and guard towers. They were made of knowledge. The knowledge that he had been on the wrong side, that his suffering meant nothing, that his family was dying while he lived. Those bars would never let him go. Even if the war ended tomorrow and they sent him home, he would carry them forever. In the darkness, Klaus spoke quietly from the bunk below. "What do we do now, Hans?" Hans closed his eyes. "We survive, Klaus, because that is all we can do. We survive and we try to become something better than what we were. How do we do that? I do not know yet, but I will figure it out. I have to." Because if he did not figure it out, if he could not find some way to make meaning from this disaster, then Franz Keller had died for nothing. 40,000 people in Hamburg had died for nothing. Lotte was starving for nothing. And Hans Weber refused to accept that. January 1944. The new year arrived without ceremony. No fireworks, no celebration. Just another day in Camp Herne marked only by the date on the calendar and the growing certainty that the war was lost. Hans had stopped keeping track of time in the old way. Instead, he measured his captivity in letters. Helene's letters arrived every 6 to 8 weeks, each one a small knife cutting deeper. February brought news that food rations in Hamburg had been reduced again. March reported that Lotte had developed rickets from malnutrition. April was silent, no letter at all, and Hans spent 3 weeks convinced his family was dead before a letter finally arrived explaining that the postal service had been disrupted by bombing. Through it all, Hans ate 3 meals a day, worked on Thompson's farm twice a week, gained weight, grew stronger. The contradiction between his improving health and his family's deterioration became a constant ache, duller than the sharp pain of Christmas, but more persistent. In April, something changed. Camp Herne began offering educational programs, English classes taught by local volunteers, mathematics, literature, history, music lessons for those interested. The camp commander announced these programs during morning assembly. "These courses are voluntary," he said, "but I encourage you to take advantage. You will be going home eventually. When you do, you will need skills to rebuild. Knowledge is never wasted." Hans signed up for English lessons, not because he wanted to learn, because he needed something to occupy his mind during the long evenings when guilt became unbearable. The English teacher was a woman named Eleanor Mitchell, perhaps 30 years old with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and glasses that made her look scholarly. She arrived at Camp Herne twice a week carrying books and lesson plans and a patience that seemed inexhaustible. The first class had 12 students. Hans sat in the back, Klaus beside him, both uncertain what to expect. Miss Mitchell stood at the front of the classroom, a converted storage room with mismatched chairs and a blackboard someone had painted on the wall. She smiled at them, warm and genuine. "Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Eleanor Mitchell. I teach at Herne High School, and I have volunteered to help you learn English. I know some of you already speak some English. That is wonderful. We will build on that. For those who do not, we will start with basics. There is no shame in not knowing. There is only shame in not trying." She spoke slowly, clearly, making sure they understood. Then she repeated the introduction in halting German. Hans found himself paying attention despite his initial reluctance. Miss Mitchell was a good teacher, patient, clear. She did not talk down to them or treat them like enemies. She treated them like students. At the end of the first lesson, she asked them each to introduce themselves in English. Name, age, hometown, simple information. When Hans's turn came, he stood. "My name is Hans Weber. I am 27 years old. I am from Hamburg, Germany." Miss Mitchell smiled. "Excellent, Mr. Weber. Your pronunciation is very good. Have you studied English before? A little, in school. Many years ago. Well, you have a good foundation. Keep practicing. After class, as the prisoners filed out, Miss Mitchell stopped Hans. Mr. Weber, may I ask you a question? Hans paused. Of course. Why did you sign up for these classes? You speak English better than most of the others. You do not really need beginner lessons. Hans considered the question. Chose honesty, because I need something to do with my mind, something that is not thinking about home, about things I cannot change. Miss Mitchell's expression softened. I understand. My father was in the last war. He came home different, quieter. He used to say that the hardest part was not the fighting, it was the waiting, the helplessness. Hans nodded. Yes, that is it exactly, the helplessness. She handed him a book. This is extra reading if you are interested. Poetry, Whitman, Frost, Hemingway, American writers. It might help with your English, and it might help with the other thing too. Sometimes other people's words can express what we cannot. Hans took the book. Thank you, Miss Mitchell. Please call me Eleanor. We are not so formal here. Over the following weeks, Hans discovered that Eleanor was right. Reading helped, not just with English, though his vocabulary improved rapidly, but with the helplessness. Whitman's expansive optimism, Frost's quiet observations of rural life, Hemingway's spare prose about men trying to maintain dignity in impossible situations. Hans read late into the night long after Klaus had fallen asleep, found comfort in the rhythm of poetry, the structure of language. Here was something he could control. Words on a page, meaning he could grasp, small victories against the chaos. Eleanor noticed his progress, started bringing more challenging text, novels, essays. Once she brought a copy of the Declaration of Independence. I thought you might find this interesting, she said, given your situation. Hans read it that evening. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words felt revolutionary, not because the ideas were new. Hans had studied Enlightenment philosophy in university, but because of where he was reading them. A prisoner of war camp, being held by a nation that actually seemed to believe these words, that treated prisoners as if they had rights, as if they were human beings deserving of dignity. Germany had taught Hans about duty and sacrifice and national glory. America was teaching him about something different, something he did not yet have a name for, but was beginning to recognize as important. In May, Earl Thompson made an unusual request. He asked the camp commander if Hans could work on his farm 3 days a week instead of 2, specifically requested Hans by name. When the commander asked why, Earl said, because Weber has a good mind. He helped me redesign my irrigation system, increased water efficiency by 30%, and he does not complain about the heat. That is worth something. The request was granted. Hans found himself spending more time at Thompson Farm. The work was still hard cotton, and the summer heat was brutal, but it was honest work. Physical labor that left him too tired to think at night. And Earl treated him not as a prisoner, but as something closer to a partner. One afternoon in June, they sat in the shade of Earl's barn eating sandwiches Martha Thompson had packed. Thick bread, sliced ham, cheese, pickles. The kind of lunch that would have fed Hans's entire family for 2 days. Earl ate slowly, watching the field. After a while, he spoke. My boys used to work this land. James was good with machinery, could fix anything. Robert was better with animals, had a way with horses that I never understood. He just knew what they needed. Hans did not know what to say. I hope they stay safe, Earl nodded. Me too. War is a hell of a thing, my boys fighting Germans. You working my land. World does not make much sense sometimes. Hans thought about Franz Keller dying from an infected nail wound, about Lotta wasting away from malnutrition, about 40,000 people burned to death in Hamburg. I do not think there is sense to find, Hans said quietly. I think we were all lied to, told that fighting was necessary, that sacrifice would mean something. But the only thing it means is that good men die and children starve. Earl was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, well, we cannot bring them back, cannot unfight the war, but we can decide what comes next. That is something at least. What comes next? Hans asked. Earl shrugged. We rebuild. We try to do better. We remember that the men we fight are still men. He looked at Hans directly. You are a good worker, Weber. When this war ends and they send you home, if you find there is nothing there for you, you come back here. I will sponsor your visa, give you a job, a place to live. You have earned that much. Hans stared at him, unable to process what he was hearing. You would do that? Your sons are fighting Germans, and you would sponsor me. Earl stood up, brushed dirt from his jeans. My sons are fighting for a better world. Part of that is showing people there is another way. Think about it, Weber. The offer stands. He walked back toward the house, leaving Hans sitting in the shade holding a half-eaten sandwich, trying to understand how a man could offer such kindness. Summer passed. The work continued. Hans's English improved. Eleanor brought more books. Earl continued to treat him with casual respect that Hans found more disorienting than hostility would have been. In September, the camp organized a small music program. Prisoners who could play instruments were encouraged to perform. Someone had donated a harmonica. Hans had played as a boy before the war. He took up the instrument again. Practice gave structure to evenings, gave him something to focus on besides Helene's letters, which continued to arrive with their catalog of suffering. October brought news that winter was coming early and fuel was scarce. November reported that Lottie had turned 8 years old and weighed 32 pounds, 4 pounds in 7 months. She was still dying, just more slowly. Hans played his harmonica and tried not to scream. December arrived again, a year in captivity. The camp prepared for another Christmas. The menu would be the same. Turkey, pie, abundance that mocked everything Hans knew about the world. But this year, something different happened. Pastor James Hoffman came to the camp. He was perhaps 70 with white hair and kind eyes, and he spoke German with the accent of someone who had left the old country long ago, but never forgotten the language. He met with the camp commander and made a request. Could 20 prisoners attend Christmas Eve service at his church in Herne? He would take responsibility for them. No chains, no armed guards beyond what was minimally necessary. Just men coming to church. The commander was skeptical but agreed. Volunteers were requested. Hans signed up immediately. So did Klaus and 18 others. Christmas Eve, 1944, 7 o'clock. Sergeant Riley drove them into town in a transport truck. As they pulled up to the Lutheran Church of Herne, Hans saw people filing inside. Families, children, old couples. They looked at the truck with curiosity, but not fear. Some waved. Hans climbed out expecting hostility. Instead, Pastor Hoffman stood at the church door greeting each prisoner personally. Welcome, Merry Christmas, God bless you. Simple words repeated 20 times with genuine warmth. Inside the church was small but beautiful. Wooden pews, candles flickering, a Christmas tree in the corner decorated with handmade ornaments. The congregation, perhaps 80 people, sat in the front rows. The German prisoners were directed to pews near the back. Hans sat down, looked around, saw families celebrating together, saw children squirming in their seats, excited about presents waiting at home, saw normalcy and peace and everything his family did not have. The service began. Pastor Hoffman preached in English, but slowly, clearly, so the prisoners could follow. He spoke about the Nativity, about how Christ was born in a stable among the poor and displaced, about how God chose to enter the world not in a palace, but in the humblest circumstances imaginable. And he spoke about forgiveness, about how holding on to anger and hate only perpetuated suffering, about how the command to love your enemies was not optional, but central to Christian faith. We are called to see the humanity in everyone, the pastor said, even those we have been taught to hate, especially those we have been taught to hate. Because if we cannot do that, then what are we fighting for? What is the point of defeating evil if we become evil ourselves? Hans felt the words like physical blows. See the humanity. That was what America had been doing since the moment he stepped off the ship at Norfolk. Seeing his humanity, treating him as a person, not a monster. The final hymn was Silent Night. Pastor Hoffman announced they would sing in both languages. He began in German. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Alles schläft einsam wacht. The prisoners joined in. 20 German voices singing the familiar carol. Hans had not sung this since before the war. His voice cracked on the first verse, steadied on the second. Then the congregation joined in English. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. Two languages, two nations that had been killing each other for 5 years, singing the same song, the same message of peace. Hans felt something break inside him. Not painfully like the breakdown over bacon, but gently. A wall he had built around his heart crumbling slowly. After the service, people lingered. Some approached the prisoners, shook hands, wished them Merry Christmas. A woman with gray hair handed Klaus a bag of cookies. An old man, perhaps 75, walked up to Hans. "My grandson is in Germany," the man said. "Fighting. I pray for him every day. I pray for you too. For all of you. I pray you all come home safe." Hans could not speak, could only nod. The old man held out his hand. Hans shook it. The grip was firm despite the man's age. "Merry Christmas, son." "Thank you, sir." Hans's voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you." On the drive back to camp, nobody spoke. What was there to say? They had just been welcomed into an enemy church, had sung hymns with people whose sons and brothers and fathers they had tried to kill, had been treated with a kindness that made no tactical sense, served no military purpose, followed no logic except the simple human logic of compassion. Hans sat in the back of the truck staring out at the Texas night. Stars blazed overhead, cold and distant and beautiful. Somewhere under those same stars, Helene and Lotte huddled in their basement room trying to stay warm. And here Hans sat full of turkey dinner and Christmas cookies, hands still warm from shaking the hand of an old man whose grandson was fighting Germans. The contradiction should have destroyed him. Instead, it was starting to reshape him into something new. Back in the barracks, Klaus asked the question they were all thinking. How can they do that? How can they be so kind to us? Hans lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. Because they believe what Pastor Hoffman said about seeing the humanity in everyone. They actually believe it. And more than that, they practice it. That is the difference between us and them. What do you mean Germany taught us to hate? To divide the world into us and them, pure and impure, worthy and unworthy. America has problems, yes. I have seen how they treat the Negro soldiers. They are not perfect. But at their core, they believe something we forgot. That every person has value. That enemy today can become friend tomorrow. That kindness is not weakness, but strength. Klaus was quiet for a moment. Do you think we can learn that? After everything, I do not know, but I am going to try, because the alternative is to go home and rebuild Germany the same way we built it before. And look where that got us, January 1945. The war in Europe was reaching its conclusion. Everyone knew it. The Red Army was pushing toward Berlin from the east. Allied forces had liberated France and were advancing into Germany itself. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel. Cities were being bombed day and night. And in Camp Herne, German prisoners ate 3 meals a day and learned English and played volleyball in the recreation yard. The guilt remained, would always remain. But Hans was learning to carry it differently. Not as a weight that crushed him, but as a responsibility that shaped him. He could not save Helene and Lotte from Hamburg, could not turn back time and choose differently, could not unmake the war, but he could have become the kind of man who deserved their sacrifice, who would honor it by building something better when if he made it home. In February, Hans finished reading Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. The ending devastated him. The protagonist's lover dies in childbirth. The baby dies. Everything the man tried to protect is lost. And in the final lines, he walks away into the rain alone. Hans closed the book and wept. Not for the fictional characters, for himself, for Helene and Lotte, for the very real possibility that he would lose them just as completely. Eleanor found him the next class session, asked if he was all right. I finished the Hemingway. Hans said, that is a difficult book. He loses everything, and there is no meaning to it. No lesson, just loss. Eleanor sat down across from him. That is one reading, but I think there is another. He survives. Despite losing everything, despite the pointlessness of the war and the unfairness of death, he survives. He keeps walking. That takes a kind of courage too. What good is survival if you have lost everything that made life worth living? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my father used to say that as long as you are alive, you have the chance to create new meaning, new love, new purpose. The old might be gone, but the possibility remains. That is what separates the living from the dead. Not breath and heartbeat, but possibility. Hans thought about Earl Thompson, who worried about his sons, but still offered kindness to enemy prisoners. Thought about the old man in church, praying for his grandson and his enemies in the same breath. Thought about Pastor Hoffman, who had left Germany decades ago to escape one war and was now trying to heal the wounds of another. These men had not let worry destroy them. They had let it shape them into better people. Maybe Hans could do the same. March brought news that American forces had crossed the Rhine. April brought reports of concentration camps being liberated. The photographs appeared in newspapers. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz. The images were beyond comprehension. Mountains of corpses, living skeletons behind barbed wire, gas chambers, crematoria. The camp commander ordered the newspapers posted in the recreation hall, required every prisoner to look at them. This is what you fought for, he said, whether you knew it or not. This is the regime you served. You need to see it. You need to know. Hans looked at the photographs and felt a nausea that went deeper than his stomach. This was Germany, his Germany, the nation he had tried to protect. And underneath all the propaganda about Lebensraum and national greatness, this was what it had really been about. Industrial murder on a scale that made the desert warfare look like a schoolyard fight. Klaus stood beside him, tears running down his face. I did not know. I swear to God I did not know. Neither did I. But not knowing does not absolve us. We should have known. We should have asked questions. We should have looked harder. What do we do now? Hans had no answer. What could anyone do in the face of such horror? How did you atone for being part of a system that had done this, even if you had not known, even if you had not pulled the triggers or opened the gas valves? You became something different, something better. You made sure it never happened again. That was all you could do. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The announcement came over the camp loudspeakers at 3 in the afternoon. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. Silence fell over Camp Herne. 5,000 German prisoners stood motionless, processing information that should have brought relief, but instead brought only emptiness. Hans sat on his bunk, hands folded, staring at nothing. The war was over. Germany had lost. He had lost. Everything he had fought for had been a waste. Franz Keller had died for nothing. The men in the desert had suffered for nothing. Lotte was starving for nothing. Except that was not quite true, because Hans was alive. And Helene and Lotte, according to the last letter he had received, were also alive. Barely. Malnourished and traumatized and living in ruins. But alive. As long as they were alive, there was possibility. Eleanor's father had been right about that. The old world was gone. The Germany Hans had known, for better or worse, was finished. But something new could be built from the ashes. The question was what and where. Hans pulled out Earl Thompson's business card. The farmer had given it to him months ago along with that offer of employment. Come back after the war. I will sponsor your visa. At the time, Hans had thought it was impossible. A kind gesture, but impractical. He had a family in Germany, a wife and daughter who needed him. He could not abandon them for a new life in America. But what if Germany had nothing left to offer them? What if the best way to help Helene and Lotte was not to return to the ruins, but to build something new somewhere else? To bring them here where Lotte could eat 3 meals a day and gain weight and go to school without fearing bombs. The idea felt like betrayal, like abandoning his country in its darkest hour. Or maybe it felt like wisdom, like choosing life over death, future over past, possibility over ruins. Hans did not know yet, could not decide. Not until he saw Helene and Lotte again. Not until he stood in what remained of Hamburg and understood what rebuilding would actually require. But for the first time since his capture, Hans allowed himself to imagine a future that was not defined by guilt and loss. A future where Lotte grew up healthy and safe, where Helene smiled without that edge of exhaustion, where Hans himself became the kind of man who deserved the kindness America had shown him. That future might be in Germany. It might be in Texas. He did not know yet, but he knew it was possible. And after 2 years of captivity, possibility felt like the most precious gift he had ever received. Repatriation began in January 1946. The process was slow, bureaucratic, mired in the chaos of a defeated nation trying to absorb millions of soldiers and prisoners returning from all corners of Europe. Hans's name came up in March. He stood in line at the camp administration building with 200 other men waiting to sign papers that would send him home. Klaus stood beside him. The boy, no longer quite so young after 3 years in captivity, was going back to Dresden, or what remained of it. "What will you do when you get there?" Klaus asked. "Find my family, see what is left, try to rebuild." And then Hans did not answer immediately. He had Earl Thompson's business card in his wallet, worn soft from being taken out and examined during long nights when sleep would not come. The offer still stood. Come back, bring your family, build something new. But how could he ask Helene to leave Germany, to abandon everything she had ever known, to cross an ocean and start over in a country that had been their enemy? "I do not know yet," Hans finally said. "I need to see them first, need to understand what is possible." The ship that carried them back to Europe was crowded and cold. Hans stood on deck as the coast of France appeared on the horizon, trying to remember why he had been so frightened on the voyage over. That fear seemed childish now. He had learned worse things than death in the years since. They docked at Le Havre. From there, trains to Germany. Hans's train passed through the Rhineland, through cities that had been beautiful once. Cologne, Dusseldorf. Every station showed the same devastation. Rubble piled in mountains. People in rags picking through debris. The smell of ash and decay that no amount of rain could wash away. Hamburg appeared at dusk, or what remained of Hamburg. Hans stepped off the train and stood on the platform, trying to reconcile his memories with the reality before him. The station had been magnificent, once all glass and iron and Wilhelmine grandeur. Now half the roof was gone. The walls were pockmarked with shrapnel. Every window was boarded up or simply empty. Outside, the city was worse, block after block of ruins. Streets that Hans had walked as a child unrecognizable now. The bombing had been systematic, thorough. Operation Gomorrah had killed 40,000 people in a week. The firestorm had been so intense, it created its own weather winds strong enough to uproot trees and suck people into the flames. Hans walked toward the address where Helene had been living. His old apartment was gone, he knew that from her letters. But she had moved in with neighbors in a basement near the harbor. It took him 3 hours to find it. Streets had no signs, buildings had no numbers. He had to navigate by memory and luck and asking directions from people who looked at him with hollow eyes and said nothing. The building, when he found it, was mostly intact. That meant it still had walls and part of a roof. The windows were covered with boards. The door hung crooked on broken hinges. Hans knocked, waited, knocked again. A woman opened the door. 60 years old perhaps, though it was hard to tell. "Starvation-age people. I'm looking for Helene Weber," Hans said. The woman stared at him, then called over her shoulder, "Helene." "Someone for you?" Footsteps on stairs. And then Helene appeared in the doorway. Hans almost did not recognize her. She had been 23 when he left, young and beautiful, with honey-colored hair and a laugh that made the world seem less dark. The woman before him was 29 but looked 50. Her hair was thin and streaked with gray. Her face was gaunt cheekbones, sharp under pale skin. Her dress hung on a frame that had once been curved and was now just angular. But her eyes were the same. "Hans," she whispered. And then she was in his arms, sobbing, holding him so tightly he could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress. They stood there in the doorway for a long time. Hans held her and tried not to cry himself. Tried not to think about how light she was, how fragile, like holding a bird. Finally, Helene pulled back, looked up at him. "You are so healthy." She touched his face, his shoulders. "They fed you well." "Yes," Hans said, "too well. Come inside. Lotta is here. She will want to see you." The basement was dark and damp and crowded. 5 families sharing a space meant for storage. Mattresses on the floor. A single stove in the corner where someone was cooking something that smelled vaguely of turnips. The ceiling was so low Hans had to duck. Helene led him to a corner where a small girl sat on a blanket playing with a doll made from scraps of cloth. The girl looked up when they approached. "Lotte," Helene said gently, "this is your papa. He has come home." Lotte stared at Hans. She was 6 years old. Should have been round-cheeked and energetic. Instead, she was tiny skeletal, with huge eyes and a pinched face. Her arms were stick-thin. Her legs barely seemed strong enough to support her weight. Hans knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "Hello, Lotte. I am your papa. Do you remember me?" Lotte shook her head. "I was little when you left. You were 4 years old. You gave me a picture you drew." "Do you remember that?" Another headshake. Hans felt something break inside him. His daughter did not remember him. 3 years was a lifetime for a child. He reached out slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "May I see your doll?" Lotte hesitated, then handed it over. Hans examined it carefully. It was well made considering the materials. Scraps of fabric stitched together with care. "This is very nice. Did you make it?" "Mother made it. She is very talented." He handed the doll back. "I have missed you very much, Lotte." Lotte took the doll but did not respond, just looked at him with those enormous eyes. Helene touched Hans's shoulder. "It will take time. She does not know you yet." Over the following days, Hans tried to find work, tried to understand how anyone was supposed to rebuild in this devastation. The answer he discovered was that they were not. Not really, not yet. There were no POWs, the factories were destroyed, the docks were unusable, the economy ran on barter and black market goods. People traded cigarettes for bread, bread for fuel, fuel for medicine. Money was worthless. Hans had a small amount saved from his camp wages. American dollars. That helped. But it would not last forever. He watched Helene and Lotte carefully trying to assess their condition without being obvious about it. Helene was malnourished but functional. She could work, could move, could manage. Lotte was worse. The rickets had curved her legs slightly. She tired easily. The doctor, when Hans found one who would see them for American cigarettes, said the damage might be permanent. She needed proper nutrition years ago, the doctor said bluntly. Now we can only try to prevent it from getting worse. At night, lying on their thin mattress in the crowded basement, Helene told Hans about the years he had been gone, about the bombing, about the firestorm, about watching their neighborhood burn, about the winter of 1944, when the cold was so severe that people froze to death in their homes. "I thought about you every day," she said. "Wondered if you were alive, if you were suffering. Your letters said so little. I could not tell you the truth." "What was the truth?" Hans was quiet for a long moment. "That I was eating better as a prisoner than you were as a free woman. That I had electricity and medical care and safety while you starved and froze and dodged bombs. That America treated me with more humanity than our own government showed its people." Helene absorbed this, then said, "I am not surprised. We knew the war was lost. Everyone knew. But no one could say it." "I met a man in Texas," Hans said carefully. "A farmer named Earl Thompson. His sons are fighting in Europe and the Pacific. And he offered me a job. After the war. He said if there was nothing for me in Germany, I could come back, bring my family. He would sponsor our visas, give me work, a place to live." Helene was very still. "You want to leave Germany. I do not know what I want. I know what Lotte needs. She needs food, medicine, a place where she can grow up without fearing the next winter will kill her. We cannot just abandon our country." "What country?" Hans asked quietly. "Look around, Helene. There is no country left, just ruins and desperate people trying to survive. It will take decades to rebuild, and in the meantime, Lotte will suffer." Helene did not answer, but Hans saw her looking at Lotte, at their daughter's thin arms and curved legs, and the way she tired after walking just a block. 2 weeks after Hans arrived, a letter came from America. Earl Thompson had written to the Red Cross asking them to forward it to Hans Weber if and when he returned to Germany. Hans opened it with shaking hands. "Weber, I hope this finds you and your family well. The offer still stands. My farm is doing good. Cotton prices are up. I could use a man who knows engineering and is not afraid of hard work. Visa sponsorship for you, your wife and daughter. My boys made it home safe, thank God. James has some scars, but he is alive. Robert lost a leg at Okinawa, but his spirit is strong. They both say if you come back, they would like to meet you, show you there are no hard feelings. If you are interested, write back. We will start the paperwork. Earl Thompson." Hans showed the letter to Helene. She read it 3 times, then looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I cannot ask you to do this," Hans said. "I cannot ask you to leave everything." "You are not asking." Helene's voice was firm despite the tears. "I am choosing. For Lottie, she deserves more than this, more than ruins and starvation and no future. But Germany needs us to rebuild. Germany will rebuild whether we are here or not, but Lottie will not get a second chance at childhood. Look at her, Hans. Really look. She is dying slowly. And I cannot save her here. Hans looked, saw his daughter playing quietly in the corner, too weak for the boisterous energy children should have. Saw the way her hands shook when she held her doll. Saw the future written in her thin face and curved legs. He made his decision. They would go to America. They would accept Earl Thompson's kindness. They would build a new life in Texas. It was not betrayal. It was survival. It was choosing life over death, future over past. And if some people called it cowardice, let them. Hans had learned in Camp Hearn that there were worse things than being called a coward. One of them was watching your daughter starve to death because you were too proud to accept help from a former enemy. The paperwork took 4 years. Visas, sponsorship letters, medical examinations, background checks. The process was glacial, bureaucratic, designed to keep desperate people at bay. But Earl Thompson was persistent. He sent money to help, wrote letters to congressmen, pulled strings Hans did not even know existed. And finally, in May 1950, the visas were approved. Hans Weber, Helena Weber, and Lotte Weber would be allowed to immigrate to the United States of America. They sold everything they owned, which was not much, bought passage on a ship to New York, and on a warm June morning, they stood on deck as the Statue of Liberty appeared on the horizon. Lotte, now 10 years old and healthier after 4 years of slowly improving nutrition, pointed. "What is that?" "That is Lady Liberty," Hans said. "She welcomes people who are looking for a new beginning." "Is that us, Papa? Are we looking for a new beginning?" Hans put his arm around his daughter, around Helene, who stood beside him, older and wearier, but still here, still fighting. "Yes, Liebling, that is us." They arrived at Ellis Island, went through immigration, received their papers, became legal residents of the United States, and then they boarded a train to Texas. Earl Thompson met them at the Hearn train station. He looked older, gray hair turned white lines deeper around his eyes, but his grip was still firm when he shook Hans's hand. "Welcome home, Weber. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, for everything." Earl waved away the gratitude. "Come on, Martha's got dinner waiting." "And Lotte," he said, kneeling down to her level. "I heard you like drawing. My granddaughter does too. She is about your age. You two will get along fine." Lotte's eyes went wide. "A friend, yep. And we got horses if you want to learn to ride." The house Earl had prepared was small but clean. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, running water and electricity. To Helene, used to a basement with 5 families, it seemed like a palace. That first night after Lotte had fallen asleep in her own bed for the first time in her life, Helene and Hans sat on the porch looking out at the Texas stars. "We are really here," Helene said. "We made it." Hans took her hand. "We did. And tomorrow we start building." The work was hard but honest. Hans helped Earl with the farm, improved the irrigation, repaired machinery. He learned American farming techniques, learned to drive a tractor, learned that physical labor done for good reasons felt different than labor done from desperation. Lotte went to Hearn Elementary School. Struggled with English at first, but children are adaptable. Within a year, she spoke without an accent. Within 2, she had friends. Within 3, she was just another Texas girl who happened to have parents who spoke German at home. In 1955, Hans had saved enough with a loan from Earl to open his own business. A small bakery on Main Street. Weber's German Bakery. Bread made with gratitude. The first customers were curious locals. The bread was different from what they were used to. Denser, darker, more flavorful. Word spread. Soon Hans was baking 60 loaves a day, then 100, then hiring help. In 1958, Hans became an American citizen, took the oath with tears streaming down his face. Helene and Lotte, now 18 and applying to college, stood in the courtroom and applauded. The judge who administered the oath shook Hans's hand afterward. "Welcome to America, Mr. Weber, officially this time." "Thank you, Your Honor. This means everything to me." Lotte graduated from the University of Texas in 1962 with a degree in education, became a teacher, married a good man named David Miller, had 3 children who grew up eating Opa Hans's bread and hearing stories about the old country that seemed impossibly distant. Earl Thompson died in 1970 80 years old, surrounded by family. At the funeral, Hans gave a eulogy, spoke about kindness and forgiveness and how one man's generosity had saved 3 lives. Many of you knew Earl Thompson as a farmer, Hans said, as a neighbor, as a friend. I knew him as something more. I knew him as the man who taught me that enemies can become family, that yesterday's battlefield can become today's home, that the best way to honor the dead is to help the living. He paused, gathered himself. Earl's sons fought Germans in Europe and the Pacific, and when the war ended, instead of hating Earl, I hired a German, sponsored my family's immigration, gave us a chance at a future. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that gift. Hans retired in 1985, handed the bakery to his grandson, also named Hans, who ran it with the same dedication. The business thrived, became a Hearn institution. Politicians came for bread during campaigns. Families bought rolls for Sunday dinners. The smell of baking bread became synonymous with Main Street. On his 80th birthday in 2000, the town threw Hans a party. 200 people came, former customers, friends, fellow business owners, and Klaus Hoffmann, who had emigrated to Minnesota after the war and driven down for the occasion. The 2 old men sat together, white-haired, now their hands shaking slightly as they held their coffee cups. "Do you remember Camp Hearn?" Klaus asked. "Every day." "Do you ever regret staying?" Hans looked around the room. At Lotta, 60 years old, laughing with her children. At Helene, still beautiful at 80, talking with Martha Thompson's daughter. At the community that had welcomed them and made them part of itself. "Not once," Hans said. "Not for a single moment." Hans Weber died in 2005, 88 years old, in his sleep. The funeral was held at the Lutheran Church of Hearn, the same church where he had sung Silent Night 60 years earlier. Over 500 people attended. In his will, Hans left instructions for a plaque to be mounted in the bakery. It read, "From enemy to neighbor, from prisoner to citizen, from darkness to light, in memory of those who showed kindness when they had every right to show hatred. In gratitude for America, which defeated me not with weapons but with humanity." Below it was a photograph. Hans in his Wehrmacht uniform, 1943, and beside it, Hans cutting the ribbon at the bakery opening, 1955. 2 versions of the same man, 2 different worlds. The bakery still stands today, run by Hans's great-granddaughter, Emma Miller. The bread is still baked using Hans's original recipes. The plaque still hangs on the wall. And every December on Christmas Eve, the bakery closes early. The family gathers at the Lutheran church. They light candles, they sing hymns, and they sing Silent Night in 2 languages, just as Hans did that night in 1944, when he learned that kindness could be stronger than hate. That is the legacy of Hans Weber. Not that he fought and lost, but that he rebuilt and loved. Not that he was imprisoned, but that he found freedom. Not that he left one country behind, but that he helped build a better one. America did not defeat Germany with bombers or tanks. Those helped. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. America defeated its enemies by treating them as human beings, by feeding them when they were hungry, by healing them when they were sick, by showing them that another way was possible. Hans Weber learned that lesson in Camp Hearn, and he spent the rest of his long life teaching it to anyone who would listen, that there is no enemy so terrible they cannot be shown compassion, no divide so deep it cannot be bridged, no past so dark it cannot be redeemed. All it takes is the courage to choose kindness over hatred, to see the humanity in everyone, even those who once tried to kill you. That is the American way. Not perfect, never perfect, but always striving, always believing that tomorrow can be better than today, that people can change, that enemies can become friends. And that is why Hans Weber, former lieutenant in Rommel's Africa Corps, died a proud American. Not because he forgot where he came from, but because he found where he belonged.